de la République en Iran.
The Foundation FEMO published last year a book after the negotiations and nuclear deal.
Et ce livre était prémonitoire.
This book was predicting things that will happen.
En ce qu'il annonçait que l'accord de Vienne ne tiendrait pas.
And it was saying that the Vienna nuclear deal will not work.
La suite l'a montré.
And the event has shown this to be exact.
Voilà. Maintenant, nous en sommes au moment où il faut savoir que faire pour l'avenir.
Now we are at the time that we must think what we will have to do for the future.
Nous savons tous que les problèmes du Moyen-Orient et indirectement les problèmes de l'ensemble du monde sont liés au comportement de l'Iran, une grande partie des problèmes du moins.
We know that the future of the Middle East and the world are depending to the attitude of the Iranian regime.
Oui, l'Iran est ainsi à la fois la cause et certainement la solution d'une partie de ces problèmes.
At the same time, the Iranian regime is the cause and it could be also the solution of these problems and crises.
Et nous savons tous aussi que le problème de l'Iran, c'est le régime de l'Iran et que le régime de l'Iran est à la fois la cause et le problème de à la fois la cause et la solution de beaucoup de problèmes, aussi bien en Iran qu'au Moyen-Orient et dans l'ensemble du monde.
And Iran, as I said, is at the same time the cause and could be also the solution of the crisis in this part of the world.
Je n'en dirai pas plus. Ce matin, nous allons avoir les meilleurs spécialistes qui vont faire le point avec sous la présidence de M. Bloomfield.
This morning we have a panel of specialists who will, under the leadership of Mr. Bloomfield, will explain us this situation.
Il n'y aura pas de traduction, ça ne sera qu'en anglais.
It will be in English. It will be
Et cet après-midi, nous aborderons un autre sujet qui est très important et qui n'est pas connu des opinions publiques, y compris des politiques, y compris des spécialistes, c'est le problème des gardiens de la Révolution. Quel rôle jouent-ils? Quel rôle peuvent-ils jouer? Quelle attitude doit-on avoir à leur égard?
This afternoon we will have another panel which will discuss the question of revolution regarding Iran, an entity that is not well known in the West, and we will discuss this issue this afternoon.
Et nous terminerons par un panel qui se penchera sur la question suivante que j'évoquais tout à l'heure en disant que le régime de l'Iran était la cause et la solution de beaucoup de problèmes. Nous essaierons de voir quelles peuvent être les alternatives politiques dans un pays comme l'Iran.
And the last panel in the afternoon will discuss, as I said, the solution, the alternative that could be available for the future of Iran to bring change in the world.
Voilà, vous êtes tous, j'en suis persuadé, très désireux d'avoir la suite. Je m'arrête et je donne la parole à ces brillants intervenants que je vous propose déjà d'applaudir.
Monsieur Cocombet, merci infiniment. Malheureusement, je ne parle pas couramment, alors il faut parler en anglais. So good morning, everyone. I'm Lincoln Bloomfield, and we're going to talk this morning about policy on Iran. And the question is, whose policy on Iran? We have here a very distinguished panel, present company excluded, of Americans and Italian, and if I'm not mistaken, from Spain, am I correct? Portugal. And so we have European and American perspectives, but there is also the Iran perspective. So I'm hopeful that we can talk a little bit about the American side of policy on Iran, the European side, whether the two are traditional allies, whether they can agree on policy on Iran, and ultimately, whose policy are we talking about? And that would be the 80 million people of Iran. I will start simply to introduce the subject, and then we will go from your left to the right. We will come right across, and I'll introduce the panelists. You saw 10, 15 years ago, the Americans and the United Nations were imposing a lot of sanctions on Iran because there was no trust on the question of the secret nuclear program that was exposed by the organized opposition, the NCRI. in 2003. After that, President Obama entered into negotiations at the invitation initiative of Iran and extended an olive branch, looking for understanding between the United States and the Iranian regime. 5 years later, there was a nuclear agreement, but not a lot of trust. In fact, Iran became very aggressive to its neighbors and engaged in gross human rights abuses, even more so after negotiations began. And so President Trump has withdrawn from the nuclear agreement, which creates an issue with the US and Europe. And the Secretary of State of the United States, Mike Pompeo, has listed 12 demands. Some people say that this is a very hard line, it's an impossible bar for Iran to meet in order to satisfy the Americans. But every one of the 12 demands has to do with aggression and secret nuclear enrichment and lack of information and disclosure about the nuclear program, as well as ballistic missiles and aggression against Syria, against Yemen, against the rest of the Middle East, and terror groups. And so so my question for the panelists to start off will be, please give us your thoughts on where we go from here, and how do we unite as Europeans and Americans, and how do we find common ground with the people of Iran. So to discuss these issues, we will begin with the former Foreign Minister of Italy, Minister Giulio Terzi. We will then hear from Senator Robert Torricelli, former senator from New Jersey, and then from Linda Chavez, the former director of the White House Public Liaison, from Maria Ryan, president and CEO of Cottage Hospital, Woodsville, New Hampshire, from my colleague, Ambassador Adam Ereli, the former ambassador to Bahrain and the former spokesperson of the United States Department of State. And we will finish with our Portuguese friend, Paulo Casaca, the executive director of the South Asia Democratic Forum, which is based in Brussels. He is a former member of the European Parliament. So without further ado, let me ask Minister Terzi if you would please give us your thoughts.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. I'm very pleased and honored to be here. I congratulate to the president of FIMO, and especially for the vision that FIMO has proposed, publishing the book much earlier than the latest event, developed in a way that shows all the weakness and really the difficulties that the regime is encountering. I would like to spend just a few words on what, in commenting the European position on Iran, as it is now and as it has been over the last 3 years. And European position, I mean European position, the position by the European institution, Commission, all the major organs of the Commission, and the major EU governments, especially those which belong to the 5+1 negotiation. The first point I would like to make is that this policy of appeasement at all costs that the Europeans are carrying on with the Iranian regime is based on a false assumption and on a dangerous narrative. The assumption and the narrative are that Rouhani regime is an improvement and a sort of a guarantee for Western interest in the region. And this is completely wrong, because we know very well that not only Rouhani is very much inserted in a leadership which is exactly the leadership belonging to the great leader, to Ayatollah Khamenei, which has not changed in its fundamentals and in general messianic vision of bringing the Shias ahead of all the Muslim world and dominating the region, but is also creating a situation that is really destroying the Iranian economy with no real fight against corruption, modification of the structural elements of the economic system, no control on the banking and the financial tools which continue to fuel and to be at the basis of recycling in support of terrorist activities, and therefore increasing the strength of the IRGC and the security very oppressive system. So this assumption and these ideas that the Europeans continue to present, to float, interacting with Iran must be modified, must change. And it is extremely important that Europeans come together with the Trump administration in finding a common roadmap to address the Iranian problem. How to do that? The way ahead is to continue pressuring and establishing conditionalities in our relationship, also in European Union relationship with Iran. It is completely wrong to pursue other ways, such as increasing cooperation across the board, not only cultural and political, but even, as in some member states has happened, even in the military and intelligence field with Italian counterparts, giving very mixed signals and the possibility of misinterpretation, which are dangerous to the Western security. So this is a major aspect that must be considered and changed in European politics. The second aspect is the economic relations. I'm part of a world in Italy which has seen over the last couple of years, especially with Renzi and Gentiloni's government, and now, thanks God, we have a new government which is reviewing the fundamentals of our security and economic policy in another direction, and much closer and much more compatible with the American administration. But over the last couple of years, we have seen some things which are completely ununderstandable. And I make just an example. Last December, in the budget law, the Italian government has inserted a fund of 5 billion euros in support for Italian companies and investment on the Iranian market. Guarantees, export guarantees, investment insurance, and so on. And in that law, some like-minded senators and member of the Chamber of Deputies tried to insert a clear reference to the European regulations and norms which are conceived to fight the risk of terror financing, recycling for terrorist purposes, and so on. And the government voted against even those amendments, just to give you the impression, the mood that exists. It is extremely important to be more serious, to interact between Europe in order to avoid this derailment of European policies, just to continue to give our entrepreneur the impression that the Iranian market is an El Dorado. It is not an El Dorado. It's a trap full of risk. It was already in the past, even before the Trump administration took power in Washington, but now it's very evident that there are enormous risks for European companies, and Italian companies, for instance, even major companies, are already suffering for the wrong decisions which were pushed to take by the Renzi and Gentiloni government. I'd like to conclude about the action that the Iranian regime is carrying on recently, and really the unacceptable tricks that they're trying to use to try to disseminate hatred and even provoke divisions among Iranians, to try to undermine the spontaneous and very important revolt that more than 140 cities in Iran have taken place over the last 7 or 8 months. And I would like just to mention the latest case, which is, let me use this word, revolting, in my opinion. And it is the interview that was given to Bloomberg by Reza Pahlavi, the son of the former Shah. And I believe that in that review and the fact that in that interview that he gave, and the fact that he said, well, all in all, it's better to support the regime than support the PMO's MEC, because we have to, I was talking against the policy of appeasement. Here is not policy of appeasement, here is a policy of complicity and co-responsibility which cannot be accepted in any possible way. And that's why I would like to use this opportunity of saying a couple of words to reiterate strong support to President-elect Mariam Rajavi to continue her fight, because we cannot accept that from his golden exile, the son of the last and discredited rule of Iran speak against the only and truly democratic resistance, which is the PMO in Mecca. Is it a family revenge? Is it anger because of the fight for democracy and freedom that the Mujahideen have always pursued against Shah Pahlavi first and the Mullahs regime after? And I think that we should show openly that we don't fall in this last trap by the Iranian regime and his accomplices. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister. Senator Torricelli, you have your finger on the pulse of American politics, former senior legislator, you're a commentator on the media, you're in Washington. You've seen what's happened with American policy in recent moves, you've watched what's happening in Iran. Give us your thoughts on policy in Iran from a Washington perspective.
I will, but before I get to Iran, I have to deal with a very important subject, and that is Italy. I am heartened to know that you think that the new government is going to lead to good American-Italian cooperation, because obviously there's very much a fear of the opposite. And we're all very concerned about it. Italy obviously does need new leadership, new policies. It obviously has some fundamental problems for all of its strength, and we all wish it well. I just hope that is done in a cooperative spirit with the United States, and I was heartened by your remarks. Having now said positive things, let me run the risk of uniting everyone in the room who's not an American against me. But by being as frank as I can. I'm an unlikely proponent of Trump policy, as having been in the Democratic leadership in the Congress for many years. But it appears to me that by and large, the Trump policy on Iran, what we are doing is what everybody else in a quiet moment is thinking. No one can genuinely believe that there is a long-term future in the family of nations if our goal is international reconciliation, the spreading of markets and prosperity, the strengthening of international institutions, with the Iranian regime at the table. There could not be more evidence that that simply is not possible. And we all recognize that getting from here to there, changing the regime, is dangerous, messy. A lot of people and a lot of interests will get hurt. But no one can genuinely believe at this point, after Syria, after what's happened in Iraq, after the use of these horrendous weapons, that there's really an alternative. So we can all differ on Donald Trump. We can all have our views about him and his unusual personality and some of his policies. But has he not just done with Iran what we all really hate to admit really has to happen? We have a brief and probably fleeting moment in history where the democratic nations are in strong economic position, have the prevailing political philosophy of our time, control most major international organizations, and are as close to military hegemony as they will ever get. That may not last. There are many new players rising on the horizon that are not necessarily democratic, will have military and economic strengths of their own, different ideas that may not include democratic idealism. If we're going to deal with the mullahs and outlaw regimes like it, it's only now. Now, critics can say that the United States, with its 12 points from Secretary Pompeo, has set a not high but an impossible bar to meet. Therefore, the goal really isn't reconciliation. Exactly right. I think that's true. And there's no reason why we should be compromising on those standards. And Iran that wants to join the family of nations shouldn't be given a separate deal. Here's the deal: how you have to behave and act like every other leading nation. This is not, the most disparaging term in American diplomacy, some banana republic. This is a nation of 80 million people that, if it were functioning properly with a normal economy, normal government, normal trade, normal leadership, would be a great regional, if not international, economic power. There should be no separate deal. How it governs itself, how it treats its people, how it behaves in the family of nations, how it arms itself, how it conducts itself with its neighbors, should be to the highest standards. That's what Pompeo's 12 points are about. No separate deal. Does that mean that we'll never really reconcile with the mullahs? To be fair, to be honest, yes, it does. It means that we are in a state, even if unacknowledged, of attempting regime change. I am heartened, although, to be fair, I don't think other nations in the Western Alliance are as being honest about the future as we are publicly. The cooperation that appears to be coming from Europe on the economic side with the new American standards against Iran are at least begrudgingly cooperative. That can all lead to the same place. The regime has to go. And there's only two ways to get there. We do this through economic pressure, which leads to internal political change, or it happens militarily. No one should want it to happen militarily. And those who are against a military answer with the regime, we can't also be against the economic. Or how do you intend to get there, unless you think this is a permanent state of affairs for the Iranian people? Is it going to succeed? Inevitably. Tomorrow? I wish it would, maybe not. Thought it would. Under the normal state of affairs, the economic pressure, political pressure on the Iranian people is so intense, one would think this would happen almost immediately. But there is a lot of experience in the human condition of being willing and able to accept far more punishment than you would think possible. People endure more than you think they could ever endure before they revolt. Iran is one more test case of that, as is North Korea, as was Mao's China, as was Stalin, as was Nazi Germany. There are a lot of cases where people endure more than you'd ever believe. But in the end, it still only leads to one place. So while delayed, it will happen. We all wish that many nations would come forward and take the lead. They have not. We all have our roles in history. Our European allies may choose other fights that we don't choose. We can be supportive from the sides. In this case, it appears to be something the United States is going to lead. But lead it will. And those nations who want to avoid conflict realize, again, there's only two ways out: this road or the military road. This is the path better taken.
Thank you,
Linda.
Senator. Linda Chavez, you have been a commentator, White House liaison with an eye on public opinion across the United States. You've watched U.S.-Iran policy. You know what's happening today, as has been discussed already. Give us your thoughts and your perspective on policy in Iran.
Well, I wish that there was more I could say about public opinion in the United States on Iran. Unfortunately, I think the American public is not as focused on this issue as I would like to see them be. I find myself in an odd position of being a Republican, a conservative, and yet nervous about the Trump administration, even when I agree, as I did, with the administration's decision to pull out of the agreement on denuclearization in Iran. What I am concerned about is what follows, and will we have the will to be able to exert the kind of economic pressure that is going to be needed with respect to Iran? And will we have the ability to get cooperation from our European allies? And I think this is made somewhat more difficult now by the ongoing trade disputes between the United States and the European Union. I think we ought to be focused on the big issues, and trade and trade deficits are not one of them. We would be much better to be focused on the threat that is posed by Iran and be working with our European allies to try to bring them along and to ensure that they are going to exert the kind of pressure that's needed to see that kind of response within Iran itself. Because I agree with Senator Torricelli and former Foreign Minister Terzi that if we're going to have change, that change is going to have to come at the top in Iran, and it's going to have to be led by the Iranian people. There is not going to be a military response that will change the regime. This is going to have to be a democratic revolt by the Iranian people. And so I would hope that the administration would be more active, number one, in reaching out to the democratic resistance, talking to those in the PMOI, to try to get a better sense of what this organization stands for, what kind of regime change they would like to see, and the democratic principles that Madam Rajavi and others in the organization have put forth, because that, to me, is the only acceptable future. I am heartened that in the recent discussions between John Bolton and Putin, that one of the issues that appears to be on the table is for the upcoming summit between President Trump and Mr. Putin is the withdrawal of support from the Russian government for Iran's presence in Syria, because this is a destabilizing force, not just in Syria, but throughout the region. So there may be some progress that will come out of this. I am hopeful, however, that when President Trump actually gets to the summit, that we don't see a repeat of what we saw in North Korea, which is support for Mr. Putin without concomitant kinds of assurances that the Russians are going to indeed play a positive role in the region, which they have not to date. So I stand hopeful that the Trump administration will follow through. For those of you who've been coming to these conferences, John Bolton is a name well known to you. He's been at many of these conferences. I have a lot of faith in John. He does know this issue, and he knows it well. What I'm hopeful is that President Trump listens to John Bolton.
Thank you, Linda. Turning to your right and my left. Now, Maria Ryan, you and I both come from the part of the United States known as New England.
Yes.
And your state of New Hampshire has an official slogan, live free or die.
Absolutely.
Which is a very strong...
There are worse evils than death.
That's right.
By General John Stark.
So you are an executive in private life. Give us your perspective on U.S. policy and on policy on Iran, from what you see.
I'm not a politician. I look at it in simple terms. You know, Iran, the country, historically so rich in culture, actually so progressive, and at one time adored women. And women held very powerful positions, and then things changed. And under this regime, hundreds of thousands of people have been executed. Basic human rights are ignored. And especially with the women, they are so oppressed. They can't ever be president, can't be a judge. Just think of it, they consider a girl legal age 9. Does that mean she can get married at 9? Quite possibly. There's so many abuses going on in Iran, and I am so proud that the people are speaking up. And it does take some economic sanctions. I do believe in that. Problem is, it hurts the people. It hurts the heart of the country. But the thought is you do these economic pressures and the people rise up. And they are rising up. We saw it in December, January, over 142 demonstrations. But the most impressive was the last few days ago in Tehran. All those people coming out, their economy's in shambles. The rial is not worth anything. So that's very important that it is coming from an organic source, but they are going to need help. We can continue to do economic sanctions. We can ask our European allies to go in on that line of thinking, or we could take a very bold stand and recognize Madame Rajavi as the president of NCR. Wouldn't that go a long way? Yeah, very different thought. I don't know if it can happen, but I think the more we talk about it, just today in the New York Times, Madame Rajavi's 10-point plan was published. I agree with Linda. I hadn't seen a lot of it in the American newspapers about what's going on in Iran, and it's a big deal. I never thought I would see North and South Korea coming together. I think we're going to see it in our lifetime for a free Iran. And it's important. And it's important to us, whether you're European or American, because Iran is the #1 supporter of terrorism. And the people of Iran do not want a nuclear Iran. They don't. And I adore my president, President Trump. I think it took boldness and guts not to continue with that nuclear agreement, because it was a sham. It really wasn't showing where the nuclear weapons were. So I'm very proud of that bold move. And when I look at Madame Rajavi's 10-point plans, it's so much like the United States, right? We want to be able to vote in a fair election. We want gender equality. We want all those things that Iran wants. And I know we're going to see it. Thank you.
Thank you. Adam Ereli, you're a career American diplomat. You know foreign policy from many years of experience at high levels. What's your view on policy on Iran?
Well, I guess I would start off by saying maybe something we could all agree on is, what a difference a year makes when you think of where Iran was and the United States policy was last year versus where it is today. I mean, at least we know where we stand, right? And we also know that where we stand is working. So I think that's something that's very salutary. I guess I would also say is what a difference. If 1 year makes a big difference, 2 years makes double that difference. So the trend line certainly seems to be moving in the right direction. Look, there was a lot of the other point I would make is that sanctions are working, and we need to remember that, and we need, in my view, to take that as our as a key point of reference. As Mary said, the rial reached Maria. Sorry, as Maria.
Mary, Mother of God.
as Maria said, I mean the rial has reached 90,000 to the dollar a few days ago, which is extraordinary. And again, let's be clear, it's both good and bad. It's good in the sense that it shows that the regime is under pressure. It's bad because for the Iranian people, and we should always bear that in mind, that there are two sides to every coin, and the sooner we can free them and turn this around, the better it would be for everybody. But the other again, sort of two-edged sword, I would just commend to you a picture on Twitter of an old man in Tehran who's holding up a sign that says, I'm offering my left kidney for sale. I'll take $500 here's the address to come to get it. I mean, if that's not a sign of desperation, I don't know what is. So in terms of policy recommendations, I would offer three. Well, actually one, with three sort of underneath it. Is, policy recommendation, the basic policy recommendation is double down on the sanctions and double down on the pressure on the Iranian regime, because that is the only thing that's going to, A, bring it down, B, create a better future for the Iranian people. What does double down on the sanctions require? Number one, enforcement of those sanctions. What's critical is cutting Iran off from the international banking system, making sure they can't use SWIFT, making sure that other central banks to our European friends, other central banks that might engage in currency transactions with the Iranian regime be sanctioned. This is going to require a great degree of political will from the United States. Enforcing secondary sanctions, meaning those companies that do business with Iran, we sanction them and their assets. And finally, on the oil, cutting Iran off from the international oil markets, which the United States administration is committed to doing, and which is the right thing to do. Second, I think the second policy recommendation after doubling down on the sanctions is, I think it's important that we, and our colleague from Italy talked about this a little bit, I think it's important that we expand the international coalition that is isolating Iran. And we've talked about the Europeans, that the Europeans are absolutely critical in making the sanctions work. But also, I think we need to, and we're doing this, but is to expand the coalition of the Middle East states that are working to isolate Iran. Fortunately, we're knocking on an open door there, in the sense that Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, certainly Bahrain, which is a country that I know very well, have religion on this point, in the sense that they recognize Iran as an enemy and they are committed to addressing the threat. We've already seen, I think, those countries take positive steps in cooperation with us and, frankly, in cooperation with Russia to isolate Iran. And I point to the Saudi-Russian cooperation on oil supply and pricing. Believe me, from Saudi Arabia's perspective, their ulterior motive, beyond securing, the price and their share of the market, is to strike a body blow against Iran, and that's a good thing. But I would also point to a place like Yemen, where Saudi Arabia and the UAE took a very courageous move and, frankly, put the lives of their citizens on the line to prevent Iran from expanding its regional hegemony. I think it's, frankly, a shame that the United States has been so ambivalent in their support of the coalition in its actions in Yemen, because let's make no mistake, this is the southern flank of the Arabian Peninsula that Iran is trying to exploit. If Italy is the soft underbelly of Europe, Yemen is the soft underbelly of the Arabian Peninsula, and we meaning the United States and its Arab allies, need to make common cause in pushing Iran out of that part of the world. And finally, without wanting to be too provocative, who else in the region is the sworn enemy of Iran? Starts with an I, right? Israel. It's delicate, it's sensitive, but there clearly are commonalities of interest between our Arab partners and our Israeli friends that is bad news for the mullahs in Tehran. And those avenues of cooperation exist and productively exist, but certainly we see it in Syria, where who is the one country, not the United States, not the Arabs, the one country that's pushing back against Iran in ways that hurt Iran? It's Israel. They're killing more Revolutionary Guards than any foreign power has ever done in a long time, and that should be welcomed, quite frankly. The final policy recommendation on how we can, the United States policy can support change in Iran is, I guess, getting to the point that really matters, which is the Iranian people. You know, I talked about it earlier, how, you know, sanctions working are both a good thing and a bad thing. It puts pressure on the regime, but it also puts suffering on the Iranian people when a guy has to sell his kidney for $500 in order to eat. So the faster we can make these sanctions work and produce an effect, the better it is for everybody. But we need to support the Iranian people in their quest to change the regime. And how can we do that? It's really actually not that hard. Number one, we should not forget the power of the bully pulpit. When the United States says something, when I say the United States, I mean the Secretary of State, the President, former members of Congress, former mayors of New York, it matters a lot. And one of the great what-ifs of history is, what if President Obama, during the Green Revolution, had actually gotten up at the White House podium and said, "We're with you, people of Iran, we support you, we have your back, it's time to overthrow the regime." I don't think we would be in the situation we are today. So let's remember that as we see these protests growing, you know, in the bazaar, citizens marching on Parliament, in every city and hamlet throughout Iran, a well-timed, high-profile statement of support by prominent Americans means a whole heck of a lot, and we should use that weapon strategically. Second, you know, there are 1.5 million students a year that graduate every year from Iranian universities. 1.5 million. That's a revolution right there. They don't have jobs. They don't have prospects for the future. They're educated. They're ambitious. They're hungry. They want to connect to the rest of the world. And they know that their leaders are preventing that. So in my discussions, in several of my discussions with our colleagues, with our NCRI and PMOI colleagues, is, you know, this is a ripe fruit for the picking. And we should, the United States should, and this is a little bit controversial, and I don't know where we go with it, but, you know, one of the, you know, people have said that the best way to pour gasoline on a fire when you're talking about revolution is to give captive populations air to breathe, fuel for their ideas. How do you do that? You bring them to the United States. People who come to the United States or who come to Western democracies profit from that experience because they bring those ideas back home. It's like, you know, again, it's like introducing a good bacteria to a diseased thing. It just brings it down farther. So the point I'm making is banning Iranians from traveling to the United States may not be such a good idea. Maybe we should find a way to bring young Iranians to the United States, allow them to travel. You know, they're not all MOIS agents, right? They're not all terrorists trying to bring down the United States. To the contrary, let's bring the Iranians to the United States who want to bring down Iran and pour gasoline on the fire that way. So anyway, I'll stop there. Double down on sanctions, broaden the coalition and enhance cooperation between the coalition, and provide explicit support, continuous, verbal, high-profile support to the Iranian people to accelerate the change that's already underway.
Thank you. Great job.
Thank you. Paulo Casaca, you've heard one European view, many American views. You're a former European member of Parliament. Please give us your perspective, and we'll compare all the views.
Well, it's really a great honor to be among this magnificent panel and in front of such a qualified audience present here. I know that this has been also transmitted by social media. And trying to get exactly to the point, I think, getting to the beginning, to the Honorable Prime Minister, former Prime Minister of Italy, Woods, to reconstruct a common European, Euro-American front is vital. On what basis can it be done? I think not a point less, not a point more than the 12 points of Secretary Pompeo. They are brilliant. They really materialize the concerns that a lot of people, a lot of people that in both United States and Europe have been advising up to now. Of course, one of them is obviously American, but could not be done otherwise. The release of the hostages, the American hostages, is obvious. I mean, the United States could not put it in a different perspective. And so I think we should not go absolutely nothing to destroy it. And of course, rationally, as Congressman Torricelli already explained, obviously, this regime cannot do it. And the implication is clear for all of us. I do not think, however, that this implication shall be put as such on the table, since the last thing we should be giving is this excuse that, well, after all, it's all about doing what was done in 2003 with Iraq. It is not, we are not offering any way out. We just want to crash whatever happens. One thing is to know rationally what is the outcome. The other thing is to say, well, have you anything to object to any of these 12 points? Aren't they the minimum of normal relations that we have to demand for whoever to be in the Council of Nations? That's the question I think has to be raised. The second issue is really this trade, these interests that came to the point. Well, the case of Italy was obviously already put here, but in Portugal the same happened. I mean, I just saw the photograph from last year. The present leader of the Credit Security, which by the way is a lady, with this ridiculous way of dressing, and paying her respects to the Tehran leadership. It's completely ridiculous. A lot of money has been put there. Actually, I do think more than what we know about. And I think that we have clearly to put one question on the table. After the United States announced their way out of the nuclear deal, one very important personality in the Iranian regime said the following: well, it's now time to say to our European friends, either you find a way to keep this agreement on, or we will ask back the money we gave you. He said that on record. It is transcripted. And there was a silence from the European side. Actually, just afterwards, the Foreign Affairs Minister came to Brussels. He saw Mrs. Mogherini. I mean, no explanation was given. I made a complaint to the fraud authorities in Europe about that. They said, oh, we do not have evidence
to launch an inquiry. I mean, what more evidence do you need? So this issue is vital. I mean, it's the corruption, the deep corruption in the European political establishment that we have to face, and there is no way back to it. Because why is Iran so important in economic terms? I mean, if you look at the figures, of course, Iran has a lot of potential. It's true. Certainly, if it gets rid of its clerics. But in terms of GDP, it does not justify the political investment that the European leaders are doing. There must be a reason to do it. Of course, IRGC and the religious foundations are controlling most of the economy, and of course, this makes a deal more effective than with a market economy. But there must be some reasons that are under the table and that we should demand to go over the table for us to understand what is going on. And this also links with one, I think it is a very understandable Italian concern, which is this issue of these policies of having tremendous trade surpluses for years and years. This actually makes part of the so-called neoliberalism. And well, actually President Trump is questioning this state of affairs. And I think he's right. I mean, not really on the way that he is finding solutions, but raising the issue is very important. And it can help Europe redress itself. It might not be a reason for European explosion, quite the reverse. So especially Italy here, you are in a crucial position to change the debate in Europe. And you could combine in a virtuous way instead of catastrophic way, that is also a risk, these two debates and make it something that can approach us to the United States, and at the same time to say, well, for Europe to continue, we must rebalance our economic trade between our countries, because otherwise it's going to explode. It's, I mean, we had Mr. Mario Draghi that sorted out the issue for 5 years, 6 years, but it's not going to last forever, and we must find a solution. And last but not least is this issue of appeasement. I think that for those of us who saw the way that Ms. Mogherini, well, and actually Ms. Angela Merkel during the campaign, what she said about the Iranian and the Korean nuclear deals, I mean, it is lunacy. I mean, what can we say? It's lunacy, pure lunacy. It goes beyond any sort of capacity to make a rational discussion. It's so lunatic, and that these people are they are the leaders in Europe, should shame all of us, and we have to do something about it. I mean, it is not a matter of left or right or whatever. They are lunatics, and they are dangerous for our future, and we have to find a way to confront them. The sooner, the better, for the sake of ourselves, and of course, for the sake of the Iranian people, that Maria, better than anybody else, you said it. You said exactly what is in our hearts and the reason why we cannot deviate a single meter from this course. Thank you very much, in particular.
Thank you, Mr. Casaca. Well, right now, I would like to have a second round. And I'd like to ask everyone to go a little bit deeper, because we've heard a few different themes. We've heard about the debate in the United States. We've heard about the debate, the raging debate, if I may say, in Europe, about European policy. And the question is, if you look at it from the cleric's perspective, and they see the Americans are mobilizing against Iran, the Europeans are mobilizing against Iran, doesn't it become easier for the clerics to say, these are foreign enemies, they are against us, they are trying to undermine us, to unite the people against foreign aggression, as opposed to trying to find ways to support the Iranian people in their own grievances. We heard about the women's issue, and of course, Madame Rajavi and the NCRI, pardon me, years ago decided that gender equality was the answer to the misogynistic cruelty of the mullahs, which entirely favors men and which suppresses women and girls. So that's a very powerful issue. And we see people in the NCRI, and we also see other Iranian exiles who are fighting against mandatory hijab and this kind of thing. They're not united. So there's another issue, which is the Ministry of Intelligence is trying to fool people into thinking that they should be divided against each other. We've been talking about the internal situation in Iran, and to hear these experts speak, something may happen. You say what a difference 1 year makes. Well, by next year, what if something happens where people say no more, I'm putting my keys down to the jailhouse door, I'm putting my gun down, I'm tearing up my Revolutionary Guard card on YouTube. If it happens, what happens next? And what should our policy be? So how do we orient the policy to help the people of Iran, where the poverty rate is well over 27%? The rial is becoming even less valuable, which really hurts the people. So is the answer to keep inflicting pain on the Iranian population? Is the answer to reveal the secrets of the regime so that in Europe and America we have facts in front of us and we know all of the falsehoods and we can now have a policy? I would just, before I turn it to the panel, yesterday the United Nations Secretary General issued a biannual report on Resolution 2231, which was passed in 2015 to lift all the sanctions against Iran after the nuclear agreement. And the Secretary General's report, according to the UN Permanent Representative Nikki Haley, lays out the strongest evidence to date, I'm quoting, that the Iran regime continues to send weapons across the Middle East, blatantly violates Security Council resolutions, from the Houthis to Hezbollah, to Hamas, to Assad. The Iranian regime has made a habit of devoting considerable resources away from its domestic needs to support terrorism, destabilizing the region, etc. So this is still happening as of yesterday, according to the Secretary General of the United Nations.